So, my name's Anthony Lopez, and I'm going to be talking about revenge today, which fits under the theme of immaterial causes of war. This is a product of two projects I've got going on in parallel. One is with Rose McDermott and Pete Hatemi, sort of looking at developing the outlines of a theory on revenge. Still very much in its sort of initial stages, but so there's that project, then another project with Aaron Sell, looking at the differences between anger and hatred and how that relates to retaliatory impulses, specifically desire for revenge. So, any good discussion on revenge should begin with a discussion of The Godfather, because in my opinion, The Godfather is really the go-to source for understanding revenge. It's better than any academic article I've seen. It really runs the gamut of the sort of emotional, experiential consequences and experiences of revenge. So there's this great scene in Godfather 2, I think it's in the beginning or early parts of Godfather 2, where we learn a little bit about the young Vito Corleone, then named Vito Andolini. And there's this period in which his father is killed by this chieftain, this mafia chieftain, and his older brother vows revenge against the mafia Don, and then the older son is killed by Don Chicho, is his name there, sitting down looking angry. And at that point, the mother decides, okay, she's going to put a stop to the violence. She needs to intervene somehow. So she goes with her young, last remaining son, Vito Andolini, and she goes to Don Chicho and she begs for the life of her last remaining son. She says, you don't need to hurt my last remaining son. This is all I have left. He can't hurt you. He's no threat. Spare him, and we'll never take any kind of action against you. We'll call it good, in a sense. So Don Chicho sits back and he thinks about it and he reflects on it for a moment and he says, no. Right? And he says that it can't happen because Don Chicho knows that when Vito Andolini grows up, he's going to seek revenge for the murder of his older brother and for the murder of his father. And he's insistent. He's not going to change his mind. He's adamant. The mother recognizes this. She becomes desperate. And then she pulls out a knife from her robe and she tries to strangle and kill Don Chicho, giving the young Vito Andolini a chance to escape. He runs away only to turn around seeing his mother being shot by Don Chicho's henchmen. So at an early age, Vito Andolini, who becomes Vito Corleone, played by Marlon Brando, of course, grows up having been brought into the world with these very dramatic experiences of having seen his mother killed, his father killed, and his brother killed. And so this sort of lays the groundwork for him becoming this mafia chieftain himself. But let's be a little more rigorous about things here. So let's start with some general observations and first principles on how we're going to think about revenge from an evolutionary perspective. So first of all, we know from a mountain of empirical and theoretical evidence, a lot of which has been covered in the last day and a half, that conflicts of interest are endemic in the natural world. Not only this, but aggression is, this is really irritating. It's just moving around a lot. Yeah. Hello? Awesome. The analogies just keep coming, don't they? Okay, so conflicts of interest they're really endemic in the natural world, and as a consequence we see that aggression is a common instrument fashioned by natural selection for use in these kinds of conflicts. Now, as a consequence of the prevalence of aggression for use in these conflict scenarios, we see that this creates a selection pressure for the evolution of assessment mechanisms, because if you're going to get into fights and if we're going to use violence, then you need to know when is it a good idea to get into fights and when is it not a good idea to get into fights. And so this creates selection pressure for the evolution of assessment strategies and things like that, some of which we talked about with Richard's talk on the imbalance of power hypothesis. Right? We need to know when it's a good idea and when it's not a good idea to fight. But we also know that in social species, such as our own, that the decisions of others matter a lot. Right? The decisions of others matter a lot because they reflect intentionality. We don't just want to know how big the other person is. We want to know what's going on in their brains. We want to know what their intentions are, what their values are. Do they intend to hurt us? Are they incidentally hurting us? Do they value the relationship but they don't see recourse beyond or aside from the use of violence or aggression or punishment of some sort? What's going on inside their heads? So these assessment mechanisms in humans and within these conflicts of interest are not just looking at relative capabilities, but they're also looking at interests, motivations. And it's important for us to be able to have a theory of mind for knowing what's going on inside the minds of adversaries, friends, allies, etc. So what this and other evidence we have covered suggests is that humans seem to possess a complex set of adaptations designed for resolving conflicts of interest in one's favor. Okay, these adaptations help us determine when to fight. These adaptations help us determine when to run, when to forgive, when to ignore, when to avoid. And so from this perspective, violence is partially the product of these mechanisms designed to resolve conflicts. And obviously violence and vengeance and the sort of extra-lethal violence that we've been talking about are, particularly gruesome or extreme forms of conflict resolution, but I think we should be thinking about them as forms of conflict resolution nevertheless. Right, so this always reminds me of this line from Daly and Wilson's classic piece on homicide, where they say, killing one's antagonist is the ultimate conflict resolution technique, and our ancestors discovered it long before they were people. So, how does this all relate to revenge? So at its most basic, revenge represents the returning of harm for harm. Okay, I do something to you, you do something to me. But retaliation, revenge, really takes a lot of forms. If you really sit back and you think about revenge, retaliation, hitting back, punishment, all these things, we see much more extreme forms of retaliation or revenge that in which the punishment seems to exceed the initial injury by an extreme amount, or in which pleasure is taken at the observation of suffering or the imposition of cost and suffering on another person. So it's not always just a harm for harm. There are also more extreme forms of retaliation that we need to try and explain as well and distinguish from less extreme forms of retaliation. In other words, why do we have this broad spectrum of retaliatory possibilities, and how do they relate in some way to a set of underlying mechanisms designed to resolve conflicts of interest in one's favor? So rather than trying to understand the nature of revenge by looking at the sort of range of behavioral variants associated with revenge, I'd like to begin by looking at two cognitive systems that I think facilitate conflict resolution strategies in humans in order to put revenge in this more functional context of conflict resolution. So this first system that I want to talk about is the anger system. So Aaron Sell and his colleagues at the Center for Evolutionary Psychology have devised this recalibrational theory of human anger. And this is a functional perspective on anger. And it argues that anger is the emotional output of mechanisms designed to resolve conflicts of interest in favor of the angry individual. Okay, and so this is in response to perceptions that another has subjectively low valuations of your own welfare, exceeding what you think you deserve, and so this triggers anger. And now from this perspective, the unfolding of anger and these sorts of conflicts of interest occur in two stages. In stage one, there are arguments, discussions, bargaining, whatever, about intentions and perceived resource value. You want to know, why did this person treat me that way? Why did you do that? Don't you know how much this means to me? How much this object means to me? How much this event means to me? Trying to ascertain the source of a perceived discrepancy in mutual valuation. Now in stage two, there is some form of retaliation. So in stage one, there's an effort to try and understand what's going on, essentially, to try and have clearer information about intentions and values. In stage two, there is retaliation, some form of retaliation. And retaliation can take one of two forms, or both. First is simply the withdrawal of benefits, right? You decide to stop cooperating with this person, you decide to avoid this person, what have you, or you impose some kind of cost on them, right? They took your lunch, you take their lunch. They didn't go to your play, so you don't go to their play, right? This kind of tit for tat upping of the ante. Can people hear me? Am I holding this too low? Okay. I feel my arm dropping slowly. So anger, fulfills its function. Let's say when one of two things occur. First, adversary preferences their beliefs in their minds are recalibrated. They're switched, they're altered in a way that reflects a mutual understanding of how much this person ought to be valuing you. So there's a recalibration of preferences in the mind of the target of your anger. So that's one way in which anger fulfills its function. The second way is when there is a retaliatory withdrawal of benefits or an imposition of cost, as I just mentioned. And so the result from a fitness perspective is either that the initial fitness cost is reversed or that the valuable relationship is restored, right? And this is how anger functions as this conflict resolution mechanism. The second system is the hate system. So again, we're taking a functional perspective on these emotions, a functional perspective on hate. And recall that anger functions to recalibrate the target's preferences. We're trying to reach into the mind of the other individual and change their beliefs, change their preferences. And the adaptive problem in that sense, from the perspective of this anger system, is how to change minds when the minds of others are worth changing. Right? How do we change minds when the minds of others are worth changing? But hate brings our attention to a different class of adaptive problem. This adaptive problem is present when the very existence, right, not their beliefs, not their intentions, the very existence of another individual constitutes a fitness cost to you. Okay, so the adaptive problem is no longer how to change minds when minds are worth changing, right? Friend, ally, whatever, someone with a high association value. Rather, the adaptive problem here is how to destroy when minds cannot be changed. Consequently, the class of adaptive solution shifts in parallel. We're no longer interested in recalibrating target preferences, but now we're interested in the enervation of the target's capabilities. In other words, we want to eliminate the other person's ability to impose costs now and in the future, right? Because their preferences can't be changed. The bargaining period is over. We just hate them and they want them. We want them gone. We want them out of our lives. And that can either occur through avoidance, right? You can just run away, or, right, you can feel hateful towards them and seek revenge for the initial wrongdoing. Now, when we take these two systems together, it yields, their operation yields a spectrum of retaliatory possibilities. Okay, so there's the operation of these two mechanisms. From negative reciprocity on the one end to revenge on the other. And we can argue a little bit later about whether those labels make sense, but I want you to think about the fact that these are two distinct systems that operate according to distinct adaptive logics. So on the far left side of the spectrum are forms of retaliation, which I've labeled negative reciprocity, that are regulated by the anger system. They're relatively proportional to the initial harm, and they function to recalibrate enemy, adversary, target preferences. Right? We're trying to reach into the mind of the adversary, change their beliefs in some way through a bargaining process of signaling, etc. On the far right of the spectrum, as we, let's say, slide rightward along this retaliatory spectrum, we see that these are forms of retaliation that are characterized by, they're regulated by the hate system. They're characterized as increasingly disproportionate relative to the initial injury. And they function to enervate capabilities. And that's just a way of saying we want to eliminate their ability to deliver costs now and in the future. Maybe that's by killing them. Maybe that's by chopping off their arms. Maybe that's by chopping off their legs. Maybe that's by mutilating them. You can imagine the universe of possibilities, right? How can I get this person to unequivocally stop delivering harms, right? This is motivated by this hate system, and it's designed to eliminate the target's ability to deliver costs now and in the future. So the critical psychological inputs that upregulate the motivation for vengeance then are twofold. First, there has to be a sufficiently low valuation of welfare, such that this person is perceived as a real fitness cost to your existence. Their their interests are diametrically opposed to yours. So long as they exist, you cannot. This is the Harry Potter dilemma, right? I can't exist as long as Voldemort's around, kind of thing, right? There's another person that constitutes a direct and clear fitness cost to your existence. So the first critical input then is sufficiently low valuation of welfare. The second is perceived intransigence of preference structure, right? This is the implacable foe. This is, if you're familiar with image theory, this is the classic enemy image, right? The enemy cannot be turned. Their beliefs can't be changed. They are following these obligate strategies of resistance and attrition, and you have to do what you can to eliminate them before they eliminate you. So the critical psychological inputs that upregulate this motivation for vengeance, that force you on a rightward slide along the spectrum, are sufficiently low subjective valuation and perceived intransigence of the preference structure. Now each system, this hate system, the anger system, each system and corresponding forms of retaliation should be marked by, for example, distinct triggers, things that cue it into activation, and should be marked by distinct off switches, things that cause you to stop being angry, right? Things that cause you to stop being hateful. So I want to talk a little bit about that, specifically about triggers. Is that the 5 minute? Was the 5? How many minutes ago was the 5 minute? What's that?
4 minutes.
4 minutes. Okay. Well, something to work towards. All right, so when we think about triggers, right, so what are the triggers of these mechanisms? How can we say, okay, here's an anger system, here's a hate system, and how are their triggers distinct? Right, so we can say, and this is, by the way, incidentally, part of the framework I'd really love a lot of feedback on, because I think this is a really pivotal part of the framework and a pivotal part of the computational design of these mechanisms. So any critical feedback or constructive feedback would be really helpful. So the question is, what cues reveal, cues in the environment, cues in the person and behavior, what sort of cues in the environment reveal sufficiently low valuation? How do you know the other person thinks you're full of shit, thinks that you can be taken advantage of, thinks you're an important friend and ally, et cetera, et cetera? How do you know these things, right? So one way you can know that another person has sufficiently low valuation on your welfare is that they demonstrate somehow a willingness to impose great costs on you for little benefit, right? So Bob Jervis has a line in his volume on psychology of deterrence where he says, high threat is likely to be inferred when the other's reaction seems disproportionate to the objective. Right? And so in this sense, I'm basically just annoying you, I'm hurting you, I'm causing you pain because I can. Not because it benefits me, but just because I enjoy seeing you suffer. Right? And that's a reliable sign that you're dealing with an adversary that wants to impose costs on you indefinitely, right? Regardless of what your beliefs are, regardless of what you can offer. A second kind of cue that might reveal sufficiently low valuation is the targeting of symbolic versus material value. Now, this is really interesting because this is culturally unique. Right? I mean, this is unique to humans, right? You don't see this in other mammals. You don't see this in primates. Not that I know of. It'd be great if any of you know that this happens, but I haven't seen it, and that doesn't mean it's not there. The targeting of symbolic value, right? Humans care a lot about their symbols, right? The American flag, the Quran, holy sites. We care a lot about the symbols that represent us as a group not being violated or desecrated. And when they are violated or desecrated, it inspires almost reliably some sort of outrage and the motivation for revenge of those symbolic desecrations. So we have examples of Pastor Terry Jones and the 2,988 Qurans that he decided to burn. Anyone know where he got that number from? Well, could be. There's another explanation. So this was the number of Americans reported dead in the 9/11 attacks, right? And so a Quran for an American life. And you might think from a rational perspective, what's the point of that, right? But it's a symbolic attack. It's targeting a known sacred value of an outgroup, and that's communicating hate, right? This is not a bargaining technique, right? This is an act of vengeance, right? The cartoon depiction of Muhammad was not, in essence, an act of hate. It was just a comic strip, we might imagine, but it was perceived as a hateful act. Ariel Sharon visiting the Temple Mount, right? There are lots of examples of humans from one group violating, either purposefully or incidentally, the cultural symbols of another group, and that inspiring hateful outrage, if not vengeful violence. There's also humiliation plays a role, right? So there, Lowenheim and Hyman have a piece on revenge in international politics where they say there's no more humiliating experience than to have one's lack of power in relation to another continually rubbed in one's face, right? So the evidence of celebration in the face of one's suffering is a reliable cue that others have sufficiently low valuation on your welfare. Is my time up? Okay, that's good.
Go another 15, 30 seconds.
Why does this matter? It helps us understand a little bit of the war puzzle, which Dom talked about earlier. One of the assumptions in that war puzzle is that war is costly. And yes, war is costly because it costs money. But on the other hand, revenge is designed to overwhelm the cost side of that equation and place greater emphasis on the benefit side of the equation, namely how awesome it's going to feel to rub your enemy's face in the dirt. It also applies to some aspects of nuclear deterrence in terms of the rationality of irrationality, that the nuclear retaliation in response to a first strike from another adversary, it really doesn't make sense rationally, but it makes sense if we're humans designed with this capacity and need for revenge. And then the question in terms of policy applications is how do we distinguish between angry and hateful adversaries? It's a really big problem, and it's a really important problem because misperceptions at this level open the door to conflict spirals that don't need to happen. Boom.
First of all, great talk. Second of all, you're absolutely right. I agree with you 100%. You have to start with The Godfather, always, to understand revenge.
It's true.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
You could even just end there.
That's right. The third thing is that I'm wondering what sorts of data you have in mind that can make this dissociation or establish this dissociation without sort of teaching to the test, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, simply finding two things that are different doesn't sort of prove that that they're different systems.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear what you're thinking about that.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear what you're thinking about that because
Well, I have one thought.
Oh, good.
But I want to hear yours first.
I have a less coherent thought, which is, so right now I'm doing a content analysis thing with Aaron Sell, sort of looking at people's reflections on experience with hateful emotions versus anger emotions. That's sort of a, first cut at thinking about the operation of these two systems and their differential experiences. Another thing is looking at sort of case studies of leaders and their sort of stated motivations for the initiation of conflict. But to be quite honest, I don't have sort of an idea of what that silver bullet is going to be that really sort of nails that distinction, because I think it's an important one, but it's really difficult, I think, to get at experimentally, especially when you're involving the use of violence. So if people have creative avenues to think about that, I'd be really open. But again, this is just something that it's still in the initial.
Okay, really
rounds.
quickly. First of all, the chimp stuff. I think this is a really nice characterization of the difference between the in-group and out-group violence in the chimps, with the exception of the occasional in-group lethality results. With humans, I'm wondering, though, if there is especially if you're talking about international diplomacy, as we just heard in this wonderful talk that Polly gave earlier, you want to be able to switch modes. So you may want to have things that are mistakable for one or the other so that you have more flexibility.
Yeah.
However, when you just ask, like, what can we do experimentally, you might look at something where lethality is different, so it's not actually violence. For example, organizational behavior, where what you're trying to do is to get people excluded from your company, for example. So there might be something where you see the difference between anger between subgroups in organizations, or actually trying to eliminate the opponent.
Yeah, good. That's really helpful.
So I thought this was really interesting, and one of the implications of the theory would be that if, in fact, revenge is sweet, that individuals get value from rubbing power in the face of another individual, then you should see variation across gender and across cultures. Because when you were describing that you really, really hate when people rub power in your face, I thought, well, as a woman, that doesn't really bother me as much as it does some of my male friends who immediately, get up in arms about that. And I assume it's the same in some cultures where dominance is not valued as
Oh,
highly.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And there's reason to expect a lot of institutional and cultural interactions that can happen. So cultures of honor versus other types of culture. Societies in which the rule of law is relatively absent versus the rule of law is really strong. Societies where there are different ideas about gender roles, as you mentioned. I fully expect there to be some sex differences here. It's something I didn't talk about, but I in the paper, I think, and I certainly hope we talk about sex differences because it's front and center in my mind as being an important way that each of these mechanisms might diverge in their predictions and in their triggers. So that's fantastic. I completely agree.
Looking at triggers, I mean, looking at a lot of the revenge stuff, it seems to come down when I've looked at it to terms of fear, just long grinding apprehension, fear of the other person, what
Yeah.
might happen, not going away, and then also the concern, just lack of any other options.
Yeah.
And you've far more sophisticated approach there than I've taken by looking at that. But how do fear and I guess how does fear fit into this, and how does a lack of a police force you can call or that sort of thing?
Mm-hmm. Fear. Fear is not something I've really directly thought about a great deal. I mean, it's obviously in the mix, right, experientially. There's an interesting, right, if we look at the cultural, institutional evolution of human societies, we see the expansion of bigger and bigger political organizations, things like that, the regulatory power of the state. And I think it's one of the consequences of living in the modern international environment is that states don't move. We don't live in nomadic hunter-gatherer bands anymore, right? And we evolved in a world of nomadic hunter-gatherer bands where if somebody was threatening to you, if they posed a fitness cost to your survival, you could run, right? You didn't have to fight. And so it's not like, okay, there's a fitness cost, I'll have to fight them and kill them. I mean, that's certainly, I don't want to give that picture. It's not that deterministic, right? It's just it's one in a broad toolkit of possibilities, and so it's very likely that we have these adaptations that are designed to say, especially, so there's an important role for formidability here, right? If I'm a little guy and there's this big guy who's a fitness cost to me, I'm going to try and run, or I'm going to try and plan a 10-year system for how I'm going to get my revenge indirectly, right? If I feel like I want to spend that much effort and time, but at the level of groups, groups can't run anymore. So when a state is threatened, you see this in like insurgencies, right? Insurgencies being quartered in a particular part of a state or urban area, right? That can really sort of trigger a different kind of psychology when you don't have that option for running and fleeing, which is increasingly absent in the international system. So yeah, fear is it's interesting.